Hi, this is Professor Silbert, and welcome to week 3 of Humanities 1010, The Art of Being Human. And this week, we're going to be looking at the nature of story, of narrative. All of us are stories in the making. And two key components of narrative, of storytelling, are that they provide, on the one hand, identity, and on the other hand, a sense of community. That is to say that the stories themselves, you always find a character or a plot or a situation or circumstances or other characters that somehow have a relationship or a bearing on your life, with whom or with which you can identify. And it's that fundamental identity that makes a good story a good story. We keep reading. We are enjoying the character development, the plot line, because something in it echoes in the lives we live. Not that we live exactly what our characters live. In fact, as somebody said, storytelling enlarges our worlds because we actually go into, through the story, into worlds that we will never live in our regular lives, in our everyday lives. And yet, those of you who, for instance, are video gamers and whatnot, you know that you step into that virtual world of the gaming situation, of the gaming module, and you're in a different realm, right? And yet there are things about that connect you, the player, in the real world with that gaming module, that gaming plot or narrative. The other thing it is that when stories are shared, especially in shared experiences, it builds community. All of us began our lives either with our birth parents and our birth families, and therefore we grew up learning those family stories. And, it was always around the Thanksgiving table or at Christmas or some major holiday when all the family are coming in, that you heard some of those stories being told, and you got them told over and over again. I mean, how many times have you heard about how your parents first met, or how Uncle Bob, whatever, did that crazy thing back in that day? You hear those stories over and over again, and there's something about that ultimately helps us better communicate and connect with that primary group. And it's not just our families. You folks have friends with whom you get together, whether they're high school buddies or that you see when you go back home on break, or workmates in your office corporate situation, or teammates, or fraternity or sorority brothers. There is that group of people around which certain stories cohere, and you cohere around those stories. I remember, the idea of going back on break, and you get together with those friends you haven't seen, and one or the other of you says, "Hey, let's go up to the local, wherever it was. Maybe it was the Wendy's out on the main road." And that was the hangout spot in the summertime, and you all gathered there, and then somebody inevitably in that setting says, "Hey, remember the time when," and all of a sudden, everybody's back there again. That's the power of story, both to provide an identity for us individually, but then as it is shared, to provide a community understanding as well. That's a really important concept, and it's an important concept for the formation of cultures. And communities, whether it's a religious body or it is a civilization. In the video that you will be watching this week from the BBC, part 4 of a series called How Art Made the World. The title of it is Once Upon a Time. And it's talking about the power of story and of storytelling, and really the first big time storytellers. In a couple of different instances, and I've noted it in the lead-in for those pieces, you'll see that there are readings from the book, things you've already read, but nevertheless to reread them again, refreshed now as you watch the video. That's an important story because it is talking ultimately about identity and community. I give you some other examples of what he's talking about. By the way, the host for that program is a guy by the name of Nigel Spivey. He's a professor of classics at Emmanuel College at Cambridge University in England, and he has it's a great program, and I think it'll be really enjoyable to you too, especially because he brings it into the modern day, into where we live and the things that interest us, particularly our attraction to movies, to film. But he traces it back, and he keeps going back and back and back and back, thousands of years. So look forward to that. There will be a couple of examples that go around, cohere around that. And then the next big lead-in this week is to talk about the nature of myth. And I have that piece that is the opening. It's actually a mashup of the original opening of Peter Jackson's telling of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings on film. And in part one, the elven queen Galadriel, played by Cate Blanchett, does a narration about how the ring and about how the story unfolds. And she says this: history becomes legend, legend becomes myth. And I'm proposing to you a definition of myth I was given back in my college years that has always stuck with me. And it's this, and I want you to learn it, that a myth is a story that may or may not be true, that points beyond itself to a more profound truth. And that's really what we're getting at. That myth, unfortunately, gets the connotation of something being fundamentally untrue. It's just a myth. It's just a myth. That's not the definition that I want you to learn and understand, especially in this class, talking about the humanities. When we talk about myth and or mythology, we're talking about profoundly true stories at a certain level of existence. The stories themselves may or may not be true, but they point beyond themselves to a more profound truth. And it's those stories that form part of what Carl Jung talked about, and that's part of the next move here. When we talk about myth, we ultimately are going to talk about people like Carl Jung, who posited that there's a whole groundswell of stories that are developing, which he calls the collective unconscious. We participate in it. It's part of what it means to be human. It gathers with us through time and across cultures, and we're constantly being fed by it, and we constantly feed it. It's why good stories work. There are certain things that we associate with certain kinds of people. The hero, the villain, whatever, and we are nurtured in and steeped in those symbols and meanings, and we apply them in each new situation, and it helps us make sense of the world. So anyway, Carl Jung is important about that. He talks about archetypes. Remember what Plato said about archetypes, right? The first patterns of the things of which we see iterations of around us. Well, it's those archetypes that ultimately feed into that meaning making that we do. And so as myth unfolds, as story unfolds, as we gain identities and as we build communities, that leads us to certain kinds of ritual actions, certain kinds of habits of being. And religious communities are people effectively built around stories that take those stories and ritualize them and build them in again. There's a bunch of video clips that try to make that point for you, and I want you to watch all of it and read the captions that I list before you look at the videos, because that helps put those things in context. And then finally, we're looking at a person by the name of Ninian Smart. He developed a way of looking at religion and religious cultures through what he calls the 7 dimensions of religion. And he talks about things like material effects, institutional kinds of understandings, doctrinal ideas, the various narratives. All these things are part of the layering that occurs when religious communities build and thrive and survive. And so I put him there as a start, and then you get to see a couple of documentaries. First one is on Hinduism, perhaps one of the oldest traditions, religious traditions, practiced by nearly 1 billion people in the world, primarily focused and centered in India. And then subsequently, Buddhism, which arises out of North India, an area that's actually just a little south of Nepal in the northeast part of India, that makes its way ultimately, Buddhism, into China and to Japan and to Southeast Asia. And so you will look at those two documentaries as well. There are a couple of discussions this week, one having much more to do with your story and how that relates to identity and community. And the second discussion question is focused on your experience of these videos as we look at Hinduism and Buddhism. Most of us in the West are influenced by a monotheistic culture. In fact, it is Father Abraham who is the fountainhead, the head of 3 huge families of monotheism that comprise the majority of the world's religions today, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it's those 3 traditions that all find their root experience in Abraham, a wandering Aramean in the desert of the Middle East. And it's that person and then the family that derives from that person that builds these huge monotheistic cultures, all of which are grouped around this engagement of this man Abraham with God. And so we'll be looking at that more specifically next week. And then from there, the rise of the church, the Christian church in the West. Because indeed it is the Christian church that is the predominant cultural context for the humanities for over 1,000 years as we build our way towards the Renaissance. That's where we're going down the road here over the next couple weeks. So be aware of that. So watch the videos, read the supporting material that are attached either to the videos or the worksheets that are there. So those are the 2 assignments, the 2 discussion areas. Be aware that at the end of next week, week 4, you're going to be taking a midterm exam online through the Blackboard shell that'll be covering what we've been talking about, looking at, and discussing over these last, now at that point it'll be 4 weeks, right? So about a midway point in the semester. Folks, you need to do a better job of discussion questions. I'm not getting the kind of posting that the rubric's asking for. I expect you to be posting by Wednesday every week an initial post to the discussion question. So I expect posts from you by Wednesday on both discussion questions for this week 3 that we're going to be entering here, that you're reading or seeing the interview for. And then replies. Some of you have been good about that. When I ask you a question, I expect an answer back in the reply. But also, what I also expect is as you are reading other people's posts, and you should be reading other people's posts, it is a public forum after all, I expect you to be making replies and or comments to one another. Obviously, good comments, civil comments, questions. Hey, hi, and address each other. As you're making a response to somebody, name them and say, for instance, Maddie, I hear you say this, this, and this, and this. I'm wondering what this means. William, hey, I want that back and forth. I'll monitor it. I will constantly be monitoring. I get back to you if you, respond or post. I get back to you. I always do. And I will continue to do that. But you have to be doing a better job of discussing. It's just not working well enough right now. I go light at the beginning of the semester, but by the 2nd, 3rd, 4th week, you've got to get better at it. So that's an urging and a prompting to you. Get on board. Get going with that. All right. So I've talked about that. Again, the midterm, you'll be taking it online. So be ready for that. Be looking at your notes, and obviously you can be reviewing the shell on a lot of the course material. I will keep that open. I will probably be shutting down the discussion areas after I'll be shutting down the discussion areas at the end of each week. I'll be doing that pretty soon. Forcing you, by the way, to get your questionings and your discussions and your replies more, like this. So you need to do a better job with that. So anyway, so we're looking at story. We're looking at how stories form and shape us, how they feed us, and then really what the humanities are an unfolding of those stories in art and music and literature, in the world of ideas. Right? In the public presentation of our art, in architecture and sculpture, all those things have a root base somewhere in a story being told. I look forward to hearing your responses to the material this week and taking the next step with you on this journey of the humanities. Take care. Thanks.